In the 1990s, a term started being used in the media, one that frequently comes up in discussions about missing persons cases, particularly if the missing person is young and female: sex trafficking. The exact origin seems to be debatable, but over the years, the definition has become better understood by the general public. Wikipedia states that sex traffickers use force, fraud, and coercion as they recruit, transport, and provide their victims as prostitutes. Every aspect of sex trafficking is considered a crime, from acquisition to transportation and exploitation of victims. Critics state that the definition is too broad in general, and maybe today's episode supports that conclusion in some way. One of the least understood aspects about sex trafficking is that it doesn't have to involve some large-scale criminal ring that you might imagine in a Liam Neeson film. It can be one person using control tactics against another, those usually involving money, drugs, family obligations, or even love. That certainly broadens not only the scope of how a lawmaker may try to protect these victims, but it also broadens how a law of that nature could be misused, leaving an unintended criminal impact in its wake. I'm John Lordan, and today we're discussing the Mann Act. Should legislation designed to help combat sex trafficking really be called that? Well, it's actually Mann with two N's. It was named after James Robert Mann, who served the state of Illinois in the House of Representatives from 1911 until his death on November 30th, 1922. He penned the legislation, which, believe it or not, actually had an even more questionable name at the time. It was known then as the White Slave Act of 1910. The intent of this legislation was much better thought out than the naming. It was meant to put a stop to the kidnapping of women, to enslave them as prostitutes. Mann had heard stories of numerous women who were forced to emigrate to the United States, where they were put to work in Chicago brothels. At the time, brothels had become very commonplace in Chicago. The mayor, Fred Bussey, seemed to have a very light touch when it came to law enforcement related to gambling houses and prostitution. As a matter of fact, one brothel even offered coupons on election night if Bussey won the mayorship. Publicly, Bussey's only defense was that Chicago wasn't facing any problems that other big cities didn't face. A poor excuse, but not entirely untrue. Most major cities in America at that time did see the same issues. Prostitutes and brothels were so prolific that venereal diseases became extremely common. Through bribery, brothels were protected by corrupt police and politicians, and certainly Bussey was one of them. As his term continued, the mayor found himself at odds with his voters and the criminals that he was friendly with, the ones that paid him to look the other way. To appease his detractors, Mayor Bussey created a 30-member committee called the Chicago Vice Commission. It would be their job to collect the names of prostitutes, brothels, and even any stage show that featured lewd acts. Perhaps not coincidentally, this committee would not release their findings until Bussey was out of office. He thankfully lost his bid for re-election. The Mann Act, signed into law by President Howard Taft, made trafficking women over state lines or into the country for the purposes of prostitution or other activities deemed immoral illegal. Even though the White Slave Act would hint that it applied to white women only, it's a misnomer, as the written legislation protected all women. The very need of such a law may seem strange. If you simply made prostitution illegal, that would seemingly do it. But this law had other implications that were a bit wider than that. Yes, the Mann Act could be used to charge those involved in trafficking women with a crime. However, it also affected polygamists, men that were seemingly empowering themselves by taking multiple wives. The very act of transporting the additional wife-to-be into the United States or from one state to another was now also a federal crime. In the explicit wording of the law, it was now a crime to transport women across state lines, quote, for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or for any other immoral purpose. This made the law applicable to a much wider variety of cases, and this is where the Mann Act takes a bit of a turn. Opponents of this law generally point out that the measure has a racist, white supremacist angle, beginning with its very name. Additionally, the law was quickly abused as a tool in menial cases. For instance, fathers of young women who took a disliking to their boyfriends file some charges with the Mann Act. Wives with cheating husbands now took advantage of the law's existence in an attempt to get charges filed on them. The terminology other immoral purpose had left the interpretation so wide it was quickly being used as a tool for revenge. In an example of an even more abusive use of this law, boxer Jack Johnson was charged with a violation of the Mann Act when he and his fiancée, Lucille Cameron, traveled across state lines to be married in 1913. Even though Lucille, a white woman, was consensual to this marriage, racist enemies of the black boxer pushed for the charges anyway. Cameron, a prostitute prior to meeting Johnson, stated in court that she had willingly accompanied him and that she had been in no way forced to stay with him. The court found Johnson not guilty in that case, but it seemed that Johnson's enemies were not appeased. In a second attempt, another prostitute, Belle Schreiber, came forward to claim that Johnson had taken her from Pittsburgh to Chicago and that it was against her will. Whether Schreiber was compensated to come forward with that story or if she made the charges on her own accord isn't exactly clear, but this time the charges stuck. Johnson was found guilty and sentenced to a year plus 1 day. This case would inspire lawmakers in numerous states to attempt to ban marriages of white and black couples altogether all around the country, according to historian Al Tony Gilmore. Thankfully, none of those laws would pass. Johnson decided to flee the country. After years of living in various places in Europe, Mexico, and South America, he returned to the United States in 1920, and he served the sentence in Leavenworth Federal Prison. Thought to be a racially motivated injustice by many, Johnson would eventually be pardoned for his crime 72 years after his death by President Trump. In 1913, two men, Farley Caminetti and his friend Maury Diggs, decided to take their mistresses away for the weekend. Well, their wives got together, figured out what was happening, and called the police. They reported that their husbands had violated the Mann Act by taking their girlfriends from Sacramento, California to Reno, Nevada. It's noted that in this case, in no way were the ladies victims of kidnapping or involved in any sex trafficking situation at all. Nevertheless, the two men were arrested and put on trial. Even though it seemed that the Mann Act was inappropriately applied in this case, being used simply because of the men's infidelity, Caminetti was actually convicted. He appealed, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. There, it was reaffirmed that the White Slave Act could be applied in cases where the act of transporting a woman over state lines could be perceived as simply immoral. World-renowned architect Frank Lloyd Wright was accused not once, but twice of violating the Mann Act. The first case, brought about in 1915 by recently fired housekeeper Nellie Breen, accused Wright of transporting his younger lover, Miriam Knoll, across state lines. The disgruntled Breen produced letters that the two had written as evidence. In this instance, the Mann Act was being invoked by someone who isn't a scorned spouse or even a family member. Being a man of means, Wright hired famed attorney Clarence Darrow to represent him. Darrow used the same letters against Breen's case, highlighting the fact that Miss Knoll was traveling from Chicago, Illinois, to Spring Green, Wisconsin willingly, and that she was not involved in any debauchery. The charges would be dismissed, and Miriam Knoll and Frank Lloyd Wright would later become married. However, the marriage would have troubles of its own, and now named Miriam Wright, she would use the same tactic in 1926. Frank began a relationship with a woman named Olga Lazovich, and a contentious divorce was made worse when Miriam reported her husband for breaching the Mann Act by transporting Olga across state lines. In a replay of the first case against Frank, the charges were dropped yet again. The famous would continue to be targeted after Charlie Chaplin was arrested for violating the Mann Act in 1944. He had traveled with Joan Barry across state lines, presumably for immoral purposes. Chaplin fought back, stating that Berry was simply an actress that he had hired for film work. There was a problem with this claim, though. Berry had previously filed a paternity suit against Chaplin the year prior to this. It was uncovered that Berry had been hired as an actress, as Chaplin stated, but she became his mistress after the acting contract ended. Even though he was acquitted of the charges related to the Mann Act, Chaplin's career suffered. Hollywood turned its back on the 54-year-old legend, likely in part due to that case, but also largely in part due to his following marriage to an 18-year-old bride. Rock and roll trailblazer Chuck Berry was hit with a Mann Act violation in 1959. The musician was arrested on December 23rd and charged with transporting a then 14-year-old Janice Noreen Escalante from El Paso, Texas to St. Louis, Missouri. Berry stated that he had met the girl in a Juarez, Mexico bar and had offered her a job in his nightclub in St. Louis. The trial followed rather quickly, and Berry was convicted by an all-white jury. On March 11, 1960, he was sentenced to a 5-year prison sentence and fined $5,000. He appealed that decision. It was said that there was no evidence beyond Miss Escalante's word and that the trial judge had handled the case poorly, apparently referring to Berry's race during the proceedings. The appeal failed, but the prison sentence was reduced to 3 years. Chuck Berry eventually served a total of 20 months, but his reputation was forever destroyed. The Mann Act has also come up in far more recent scandals. 8 counts of violating the Mann Act were added to singer R. Kelly's sexual abuse case, where it was proven that he had transported multiple women over state lines, quote, for the purposes of prostitution or any act that could be charged as a sexual offense. Most recently, Mann Act violations were added to the list of crimes that Ghislaine Maxwell had committed while she facilitated and participated in the exploits of Jeffrey Epstein. She's now serving a 20-year sentence. In the century since its initial inception, the Mann Act has been updated to be applicable to both sexes, covering adults and minors, and placing a sharper definition of the law, removing much of its original ambiguity. An amendment applied in 1978 added the production and interstate distribution of child pornography to the list of immoral acts and made it a crime for a parent or guardian to knowingly allow a child to be used for such a purpose. It also increased the prison sentences and applicable fines. In 1986, the wording was updated from the far too general any other immoral purpose to, quote, any sexual activity which any person can be charged with a criminal offense. In 2006, it was again amended, this time to include a provision that required anyone convicted of violations of the Mann Act to register as a sex offender. The Mann Act started out with very good intentions. It was to be a legal weapon used against prostitution and exploitation, but its earliest forms were far too ambiguous in their wording. This led to the law being misused. From racially biased cases, like Jack Johnson and Chuck Berry, to other instances where the supposed immorality of the acts was debatable or subjective based on personal belief structures. Honestly, I'm just surprised that the term immoral was included in any prior definition. Was it so hard to think up the correction to criminal sexual offenses? Admittedly, we do have some laws in that realm even now that still might allow for some misuse of the Mann Act. In 2021, Mental Floss posted an article about strange sex laws in the U.S. Like in Michigan, it's illegal to seduce an unmarried woman. In North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Michigan, and Mississippi, it's illegal to cohabitate with a partner that you're not married to. And what about adultery? It's still illegal in 18 states, including here in Minnesota. Thankfully, we live in a country with ever-evolving laws, as slow as that process may be. Over time, the wording of the Mann Act has evolved and become more clear. Yes, the current phrasing still allows for some questionable laws that lean more to moral issues rather than undeniable criminal acts, but as we can see in the most recent uses, things look like they're headed in the right direction, and the Mann Act is certainly making an impact. Thank you so much for supporting this new show as we try to look at crime and laws in a bit of a different way. Please share Criminal Impact with people that you know will appreciate it. I'm John Lordan, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.